There we go. Start to show us. Yes. Well, in Canada, we sit on the right, and then.
All right, we going? Perfect. Well, hello to the Conduit Club. Thank you very much for coming to see the person you came to see get asked questions by a podcaster he likes. So we are here also celebrating Canada Day by wasting all your time with this patter up front. So Cory, happy Canada Day.
Happy Canada Day, a holiday that Canadians no longer celebrate in any meaningful way. Yes.
Yeah, no.
But it is, in fact, Canada Day. There is, I think, probably still in Covent Garden, a place where you can go and buy not very good Canadian chocolate.
Yeah, there's a place in Covent Garden you can go and buy not very good Canadian beer where the first sip you're like, wow, it tastes like home. And you're like, I remember why I left.
That's right.
There we go. Anyway, Cory, you have been on tour now. This is your 24th
Yes.
discussion of somewhat your book, Picks and Shovels, but also somewhat your general idea of how the internet lost its way. And given the content of Picks and Shovels, I want to start with one question. How many times have you been asked to, how many times have you been proposed the joke, an Orthodox priest, a rabbi, and a Mormon bishop walk into a bar?
Yes, so that is, in fact, the setup of the book, right? That there's a weird computing company in the 1980s, which was a weird time for computers. So you're a decade younger than I am. So I don't know if you remember, there was the Ministry of Education in Ontario made a thing called the Sammy Icon. They made their own Ontario computer. Do you remember this?
I don't.
It came in a huge injection molded cowling, and it had a trackball like the Centipede game at the arcade, and it booted 3 different OSs, including Logo. And it was sort of emblematic at this moment when people didn't know what computers were for, people didn't know what they were supposed to look like, people didn't know who was supposed to make them, and people didn't know who was supposed to use them. And in that moment, computers were very weird looking and had very weird business models. And it's not such a stretch that the computing company at the center of Picks and Shovels, which is a book set in the 1980s, is a company run by an Orthodox priest, or an Orthodox rabbi, a Mormon bishop, and a Catholic priest. And of course, the punchline is that it's a Ponzi scheme, that they're exploiting the trust of their faith relationships to sell these extremely proprietary computers that are just like wallet removal machines that, you know, you can only use a certain kind of paper with their printers and certain kind of floppy disks with their floppy drives. You can never get your data off of them and so on. And that this was actually not such a stretch to imagine a computer company this weird at that moment.
Mm. I mean, one of the so just more about the book itself, right? To imagine a company like this, because the book also is about industrial espionage, some violence connected to industrial espionage, hacker culture, and so on. I thought we were talking about this earlier. I was like, this is in some ways a sort of reverse cyberpunk, right? Where it's set in kind of the same time, the same era, the same time that cyberpunk would be set in, with a lot of the same ideas of, well, there is an unethical, very powerful monopolistic company that's using its ability to manipulate technology to control people and so on. But the difference is, in this case, in Cyberpunk, the technology is cool and works. Whereas in this case, the technology is bad and doesn't.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, there is this kind of latent factor in our computers that I think is underappreciated outside of very technical circles who tend not to think too much about policy, which is that computers have this universality, right? The only computer we know how to make is the one that they cooked up at Bletchley Park. It's the Turing-complete universal von Neumann machine, which is a lot of CS jargon that just means every computer we know how to make can run every program we know how to write, which means that when someone does something to a computer that's sort of enshittifying, that makes it worse, you can just run a program on it that disenshittifies it, right? That's always available to you. Every, 10-foot wall has an 11-foot digital ladder that could be made. And in the 1980s, and in fact, right up to the turn of the century, that was the norm, right? People would try and find some way to lock people in, and then other people would find a way to unlock it. And often at the same time, sort of stealing their business and stealing their customers and liberating their data. And it made for a very dynamic tech sector. I think sometimes people accuse people who were excited about digital technology in the late 90s of being naive about how bad computers could be. And I don't think anyone who got involved with things like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, a pressure group I've worked for 23 years, thought everything would be fine, right? That's not why you are like, well, this is very important, I better get involved. If you think everything's going to be fine, you just sit on the sidelines. I think everyone was very worried about how bad it could get. And if there's one thing we missed, it was how the monopolizing tech sector would capture policy and eventually make it illegal to change how digital technology worked, to reverse engineer and modify the things you own. So, most people have installed a browser-based ad blocker, which also protects your privacy. Like 51% of internet users are running an ad blocker. It's the majority of internet users, the largest consumer boycott in human history. No one's got an ad blocker for their apps because reverse engineering the app to create the ad blocker is a crime all over the world because the US Trade Representative has made it so. And so this is a battle playing out in this moment when it's just technologist versus technologist, where, if you're Mark Zuckerberg and you get up in the morning and you're displeased with a competitor, you don't have this fork in the road where it's like, well, I turn this way and I go to the building full of lawyers and I destroy these people forever. Or I turn this way and I go to the building full of engineers and I ask them to try and resist whatever technological things my competitors are doing. Back in those days, you just had the building full of engineers and they were quite scarce and they had other things to do. And it kind of limited how much of this bad stuff you could get up to.
And I mean, so moving beyond for a moment the world of the book, right? There is this drive, and you say politically, this political capture, especially of U.S. trade representatives, to not just stop people from reverse engineering and improving products, right? And this is and one of the differences, right, between the company you write about in the book, Fidelity Computing, and the companies that operate in the real world is Fidelity Computing doesn't have actually so much regulatory capture. They try to be like, okay, well, we have our sector, we've got them locked into their various terrible bundles, and not to spoil the ending for you, but they do get, nipped in the bud, let's say. But it's almost like an optimistic view, right? This is a story about a tech monopolist who actually does get what's coming to them. But in the real world, we have this enormous capture, not just of regulators, but of people like trade representatives. And like, you couldn't, for example, say, well, if you're France, you can't be like, well, we don't like what this US like tech company is doing. We think we can do it better. Right? There's actually like the state will step in and stop you from doing that.
Yeah, so in the early 90s, after Bill Clinton was elected, Al Gore, his vice president, was put in charge of like demilitarizing and privatizing the internet. And I think in left circles, sometimes we emphasize the privatizing part. We were like, well, they took away public ownership of the internet. We kind of missed the fact that the public ownership of the internet that they were replacing was military control of the internet. So, some good and some bad at the same time. And there was this creep who worked for Bill Clinton called Bruce Lehman, who's still around, who was the IP czar. He was the head of copyright for the Clinton administration. And Gore was having these hearings, the National Information Infrastructure hearings, or the Information Superhighway hearings. And Bruce Lehman went to him and said, we want to make it illegal to change a computer once it's left the factory, right? If the computer comes standard with something that stops you from doing something that's legal, changing the computer so that it does something else should be illegal, even if that thing is legal, right? So it's sort of felony contempt of business model. You're not allowed to modify a computer once it's been delivered to you. It's a fait accompli. And to his credit, Al Gore said, no, that sounds like bullshit to me. And he sent Lehman packing. But what Lehman did in his own words, I just recorded this podcast series for the CBC where we found the tape. He said to do an end run around Congress, he went to the United Nations in Geneva, to the World Intellectual Property Organization, and he got them to create treaties that obliged the US to pass this law that had been rejected. And they did, and then the US Trade Representative made it his business to go to every country that trades with the US and say, either you make it illegal to modify the products that Americans sell you, or we will impose tariffs on your country. So, happy Liberation Day, everyone. Like, we have somehow lucked into this world where the single largest barrier we had to making tech policy better everywhere except America was the threat of tariffs, has effectively been neutralized by Donald Trump. It's a very weird moment to be living through, but whoever gets there first has their choice of these very bad monopolistic technologies that you could make a lot of money improving. Like the fact that it's against the law to modify your printer so that it will accept generic ink, like not a technically challenging thing, just an illegal thing, has inspired the cartel of 4 companies that make all the ink to raise the price of ink over and over again, to the point where ink is now the most expensive fluid you can buy as a civilian without securing a special permit. It costs more than $10,000 a gallon. You print your grocery lists with fluid that costs more than the semen of a Kentucky Derby winning stallion, right? And like, as Jeff Bezos said to the booksellers, your margin is my opportunity. Like, there is no reason that some clever fella in Silicon Roundabout couldn't be selling kits that allow every ink refiller in the world to guarantee that their cartridges will work with every printer and just destroy that margin, right? Just like eat HP's entire business alive. And maybe, you know, the UK becomes to world ink supply what Finland was to mobile phones for 15 years. You know, there are 100 of these businesses. There's the 30 cents that Apple takes out of every dollar you make on the App Store. It's a $100 billion a year business that charges 3,000% more to process a payment than you pay if you're running any other kind of business. There's the fact that every automaker now encrypts the error codes that make the check engine light go on, and then each one wants $10,000 per year per manufacturer to decode those, and it's against the law to decode them on your own without their permission. Someone could just make a kit that every mechanic in the world would buy for 25 quid a month that would diagnose every make and model of every car and be kept up to date through a subscription. And that would be just like a license to print money and at the same time destroy the big 3 automakers. And remember, these are like the companies whose CEOs paid $1 million out of their own pocket to sit behind Donald Trump on the dais, right? It's not like retaliatory tariffs, which, you know, Canada's like a branch plant for America. We ship them raw materials, they ship us back finished goods. So then we put a 25% tariff on those finished goods, which just means that like everything we buy costs more. It's a very weird way to punish America. It's like punching yourself in the face really hard so the downstairs neighbor says, ouch. But like, you know, rather than indiscriminately tariffing everything, including soybeans, which just screws with some poor farmer in a state that begins and ends with a vowel who never did anything bad to Canada, we could just like laser target destroying the margins of the most profitable businesses in America whose CEOs personally gave 7-figure donations to Trump, right? That feels like a pretty good tariff response, and whichever country gets there first is going to enjoy not just the consumer surplus of like cheaper goods, but also the industrial policy of like consuming all the monopoly rents America has stacked up as fuel for a disposable rocket stage that puts your tech industry into orbit stably for generations to come. It's, I think, a much better thing. And, you know, for 24 years, I've been running around the world for EFF. And like the single thing that always comes up when I talk to policymakers is, well, these ideas sound very good, but won't the US impose tariffs on us if we do it? So, I mean, I wouldn't have asked for Trump to do that, like for Trump as the way we get free of this, but maybe now we just build an internet that isn't dominated by the worst American companies you can imagine that beggar, you know, Cyberpunk. And instead we have like a more pluralized, open, less monopolized tech sector.
I just don't think any of us expected him to do that.
Yeah, yeah. You know, my friend Joey Davila says when life gives you SARS, you make sarsaparilla. Like, you know, it would be terrible if we squandered the one opportunity Trump is giving us to make things better. You know.
So there's another thing. This is something we were talking about earlier as well, which is you write a lot.
I do.
You write a lot, and you write a lot in times of anxiety.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth also asking, how do you, in a moment of sort of, on the one hand, unprecedented sort of power for the bad guys, monopolists, and all these people, but also unprecedented foment in that everything is completely unpredictable, i.e. Trump accidentally ruined the U.S.'s main... Well, thank you. I was trying to think of something else to say. But their competitive advantage, let's say, in writing the world's tech policy for them is how do you stay optimistic in all of that?
So this is a question I've gotten at every stop on this tour, and it reminds me of the joke where the guy goes to see the psychotherapist and says, "I'm so depressed," and the psychotherapist says, "Well, it's your lucky day because the great clown Pagliacci is in town, and no one can see Pagliacci's show and leave with a frown on their face." And the guy on the couch says, "But doctor, I am Pagliacci. I am not a happy fellow." And you know, I'm not big on optimism. I think of optimism as a kind of species of fatalism. It's, I think, the belief that things get better without our intervention. It's not really all that different from pessimism, which is no matter what we do, things will get worse. I'm a great believer in hope, right? Which I think you can distinguish between like the way the plot of a novel works, which is you work out a set of orderly steps that work their way up some kind of gradient of tension that reaches a climax, and then you have a very nice, satisfying end. But in activism, in the real world, all you have is the next step that you can see, right? One thing that will improve your circumstances, and you sort of have to hope that as you ascend that gradient, you reach a higher vantage point, that you will see things that you can do that you couldn't see from where you were further down below, like Trump takes office and suddenly we can do stuff in the rest of the world with tech policy that we haven't been able to do. And that if you proceed in this stepwise way, in a very uneven way, you might eventually find your way to a better place. But in terms of sort of keeping like my spirits up, I have to say, you know, Riley hosts Trashfuture and a kind of constellation of Trashfuture Extended Universe podcasts. And Trashfuture I find extremely satisfying and funny, but it's, you know, it's very political, and I'm a very political person. I kind of can't stop looking at politics, but it always makes me ultimately kind of sad and angry. But you have this other podcast called No Gods, No Mayors that is a very sharp and funny political podcast that is biographies of mayors. And it's
Mayors
so
are the
low
world's
stakes.
biggest freaks. They're so weird.
It's so low stakes, and yet it like totally scratches my political itch. Like if there were like 24 hours streaming biographies of mayors, I think I would just listen to that as a way to kind of keep my soul going. Maybe you could say something about No Gods, No Mayors.
Wait, you're in conversation with me now.
Yeah, that's
okay.
right.
Oh, you turned the tables.
That's right. My Uno reverse card has been played.
Okay, all right. I didn't bring my book. I forgot to write a book.
Okay.
So I think I chose. So I decided I wanted to do something that would be scratch my favorite itch of what it means to make content, which is to, I don't know if this resonates to anyone here, talk about a weird guy. I love talking about a very strange guy who acts unpredictably. So I was working with one of my co-hosts and another friend of ours who's a cartoonist called Maddie Lubchansky from New York. She's great. And when we were trying to think of show ideas, we just kept on making Rob Ford jokes.
Rob Ford is the crack mayor of Toronto. You may he's sort of a Falstaffian figure.
Yeah. Big guy. The only thing he loved smoking more than smoking crack was having big barbecues for the entire city.
And he would like he made Boris Johnson look very solemn. He was briefly in an action adventure show where he was supposed to leap out of a low slung sports car, which he would just sort of tumble out of. Like it was, he really, you can't make it up. And he would do racist accents all the time and get caught on camera and then say it was an accident and then do it again the next day.
The funny thing is, so this was an example of he was in a Jamaican food takeaway in North Toronto and then ordered and kept, I was so drunk he just couldn't stop speaking patois, but then, like Jamaican patois. But the problem is, most like Jamaican patois speakers were like, we can't get mad at him, it's too good. He's speaking it so weirdly well, and I don't think any of us expected him to do that.
Also, the Globe and Mail, which is one of the national papers of record, reported very thoroughly that his brother who's now the Premier of Ontario, was the most important hash dealer in Toronto. Also, his sister was married to a Klansman who, did he shoot her in the face or did she shoot him in the face?
Unclear.
Yeah. Like
a face was shot. Someone was involved.
Also, their dad is a millionaire. Was a millionaire local regional politician. Made his money printing labels that stuck to fruit. And then Rob Ford, when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau passed a carbon tax, made labels that he stuck to all the petrol pumps that blamed Justin Trudeau for raising the price. this is a man who's the scion of the label fortune, and the labels didn't stick. They all fell off and blew away, and there were like blowing drifts of political labels in the streets of Toronto as a result of this surreal dumbass.
This perfect oaf.
It's a perfect oaf.
And then we were like, well, wait a minute. What if mayor is the highest position of political authority to which you can ordinarily rise while being a total freak?
Right.
And it turns out it is. Tons of them are. I like
the WhatsApp mayor who just stole all the money and then moved out of town, and they were trying to impeach her, and they found this technicality where she had to cross the town line every so many days in order to remain qualified as mayor. And so she would just live stream herself in the convertible she bought with embezzled money, driving slowly down the high street and then out of town every 2 weeks.
It's great. Yeah, Lydia Enlaita, the WhatsApp mayor of Bom Jardim in northern Brazil.
Who's now in prison?
Yeah, she's in jail. Yeah. A lot of them are in jail. So many of them end up in jail. Montreal sends mayors to jail like Eton sends students to Oxford. It's crazy.
So anyway, big plug for No Gods, No Mayor.
But it's what we're talking about here, right? Is what we're talking about is finding ways to have fun with it.
Yeah.
A little bit. But the other thing, right, is you ask, how do you stay optimistic? Is for a while you don't, right? You actually have to have a vision for the future that isn't just, I see Elon Musk has seized yet another means of communication.
Right.
I see Mark Zuckerberg has now lobbied U.S. Congress to make it illegal to not download the AI slop feed, right?
While his top executives are being processed directly into the upper ranks of a new military unit.
Yeah, exactly. Unfortunately, they've armed Sheryl Sandberg to our detriment. In order, on the one hand, there's keeping your spirits high with a little bit of fun and a little bit of lightness. But on the other hand, there genuinely is so important. And I don't know about you, but I was becoming kind of depressed, not having. So I sound like this, but I do live here. I've lived here since 2011. And the loss of a vision for the future that wasn't just more of the same of everything that's been happening since 2010 was quite difficult. And I mean, only recently am I finding a new one. I mean, what do you have as a vision for the future? Not just, well, this would be nice, but that can be channeled through organized politics.
It's a really interesting question. I grew up in organized politics. My dad was a NDP grandee, so this is our Social Democratic Party in Canada, and I used to ring doorbells for local candidates. And my dad ran, I rang doorbells for him, and so on. And it's been a long time since there was a party that could articulate a vision and also had a chance of winning. The NDP has a okay vision, but had very stagnant leadership for a long time and just kept creating own goals and losing and losing and losing. Same here. I am now naturalized in both the US and the UK as well as being Canadian. And so I do get 3 votes. And with 3 votes, there's still been no one I wanted to vote for.
Batman, right in across all ballots.
But I was listening to your podcast, and you talked about a politician who I then went and looked up his manifesto, and I was like, I'm going to join this guy's party to vote for him for leader of the party. And it's Polanski in the Green Party. And I sort of feel like Charlie Brown with the football a little. I mean, I remember Nick Clegg talking about how he would reverse the Blairite authoritarian stuff that happened from 2001 to 2008 or so, and he obviously did not do that, and subsequently went on to make 4 million a year shilling Facebook around Europe and saying we can't hurt Facebook or they will Chinese communists will take over European cyberspace, which is a thing I heard him say. But I'm
He's so cool. I love his mind.
this guy Zach Polanski seems like the real deal, and it does seem like there are a lot of voters up for grabs, right? There are a lot of voters Labor doesn't want anymore, and that seems to me to be at least a possibility that we can hold his feet to the fire. I'll tell you though, when I was interested in Nick Clegg, when I flirted with Nick Clegg.
You're Clegg curious.
My dad was like, well, here's the thing. Every factor that drove Labor to the right will also be present driving the Lib Dems to the right. And the difference is you won't have organized unions as a bloc to resist them. That was totally right. It was 100% right. And I worried the same thing will happen to the Greens.
Yeah, not an unrealistic worry. I mean, I suppose what I'm thinking about is just on a personal level, on a personal and a political level, is the immense power of storytelling.
Yep.
Not just to communicate, but to convince. Because the idea is not just imagine what your life would be like if I was in charge because I'm so competent, but imagine what your life would be like if all of this stuff changed. Right, because we also saw that in, sorry to everybody watching this 3 months from now, we're talking about current events, but we saw this as well recently with like the election of Zoran Mamdani as well in New York.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of stuff we mistake for technically impossible that just turns out to be people pulling the levers of policy that can be moved. So, in the digital world, I think a lot of people assume that when their technology works in a way that is counter to their interests, that it's something to do intrinsic in the technology. Like, I think a lot of people assume that when the DVD player supplanted the VHS and you could no longer record shows off the TV, that was because of some limitation in lasers, right? Like, I guess we just can't make a laser that can record to a disc and make it cheaply enough to put it in your sitting room. And it wasn't. It was because a cartel of movie studios designed the DVD player, and they were like, we never liked it that people could record programs at home. We did, in fact, sue Sony for 8 years and go all the way to the Supreme Court to make VCRs illegal and failed. So we'll just make it so that that technology doesn't exist anymore at all. And I think it extinguishes a certain imagination about what things could be. I think this is one of the things where futuristic storytelling can do more, because you can talk about devices that are responsive to their owners. You can talk about a world in which, when devices are adverse to their owners' interests, people can step in, whether that's, the hacker archetype of Cyberpunk or, I think we've like, it's okay to move fast and break things if those things belong to billionaires. And, I would welcome the most broed out tech bro in the world if their plan was, oh, we're going to make a kit that any mechanic can use to jailbreak your Tesla so that you get all of the subscription features and the software upgrades for one price, and we don't give any of that money to Elon Musk. And I think a lot of people assume that that's just like technically impossible. And it's only that Article 6 of the Copyright Directive, which we transposed onto our law books here when we were in the EU, a thing that we're not anymore, which I did vote to stay, but now that we're not there anymore, we could in fact just jettison that law. And if you want to really fuck off Elon Musk, don't like make fun of his Nazi salute. He loves the attention. Zero out all recurring revenue streams for Tesla owners. And boy, oh boy, that's going to really make him sad. And so I think that when you write about people who are like seizing the means of computation and doing things that are about recognizing and celebrating this universality and this flexibility of digital technology, not merely as a thing where the rules can change to make stuff worse for you, where every time you get a cab, they do a lookup of your credit history, figure out how much you can afford and charge you more. And every time you clock on to drive a cab, they look up your credit history and figure out how much credit card debt you have and pay you less. But where, the devices can be remade, the services can be spoofed so that they're responsive to us. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that this was very normal, right? When Facebook first opened up to the broad public, when it wasn't just for people with American college, university email addresses, everybody was already on a social media service where all their friends were. It was called MySpace. And Mark Zuckerberg's pitch to people was, well, Facebook is a lot like MySpace, but it's better because we'll never spy on you. And that was a reasonably good pitch. After all, MySpace was owned by this evil, crapulent, senescent Australian billionaire named Rupert Murdoch that everybody hates. But there was a limit to like how many times you could go read the privacy policy on Facebook while waiting for your dumb friends to realize that it was better than MySpace and come join you. So rather than make you like organize all of your friends to leave Facebook at the same, or leave MySpace at the same time and go to Facebook, which, you know, frankly impossible. You can't get the 6 people in your WhatsApp group to agree on what pub you're going to on Friday. They just gave people a bot, and that bot would take your login and password for Facebook, or for MySpace rather, and it would log in as you several times a day and scrape everything waiting for you on MySpace and put it in your Facebook inbox so you could see it and reply to it and push it back out to MySpace so you could go from one to the other. I mean, this was like millionaire on billionaire violence, right? And we not only tolerated it, we celebrated it as a way to ease the passage from a kind of decaying platform onto a new platform that had made better promises. When we just made it illegal to do that anymore, we kind of enacted like a digital Thatcherism where it just became there is no alternative as the answer to all of the technical choices that people made. And it was the result of the policy environment and not the technical limitations. And Riley, I know you're a fan of this book I really like called Careless People. Sarah Wynne Williams, who was a Facebook executive, she was this very naive New Zealand foreign service functionary who got very excited about Facebook and its possibilities for global diplomacy. She joined and was their first head of digital policy for global. And she's written this memoir about how awful it was. And it's a very good book. It's called Careless People. When she signed up, she signed a non-disparagement agreement. And so after the book came out, they took her to arbitration, and she's prohibited from talking about this book in any way. So if you haven't heard about it, that's why. You should go read it. It's very good. She lives here in London. She may be here tonight. One of the things about this book is when it starts, when Facebook is just getting going, the Facebook executives, Joel Kaplan, Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, they are careless people in the sense of someone who like throws a lit cigarette over their shoulder during a drought and doesn't even notice that they've started a fire. But by the end of the book, they're a different kind of careless. They're careless in the sense of not caring what you think about them because they understand that there's no way you can leave, that you are holding your friends hostage, your friends are holding you hostage, you love your friends more than you will ever hate Mark Zuckerberg, and so long as it's too difficult for you to coordinate a departure, you're just stuck there. And they also understand that their workforce no longer has the power they used to have, that, you know, whereas once they were desperate for technologists, now we've graduated enough computer science students and engineers who can come work for them, and you can just fire an engineer who gets stroppy and there's 10 more willing to take their job. We're no longer in a world where young engineers are disciplining their bosses. We're now in a world where young engineers are disciplining each other and saying, you better be nice to the boss or I'll take your job. And so they just stop caring about not noticing what they're doing or not taking care. They stop caring about how much ire and harm they inspire and how much harm they enact. It's a really important transformation. And I think it explains a lot. It's not that we used to have better people who ran these companies. We just used to punish them when they hurt us. And then we stopped punishing them, and the same bad people now do terrible things to us and laugh up their sleeves like supervillains.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's like, I don't, you remember that, I actually cannot remember the actual quote, but you know the one I'm talking about, the David Graeber one, right? Where it's like, the great secret of the world is that it could all be made differently.
Right.
Right. And when you talk about everything from the DVD player presenting itself just as a brute fact thrown into the world, that it's like, well, of course you can't record. Of course DVDs are in zones. What are you talking about?
Right.
It would be absurd if it was otherwise.
So go to India, buy a DVD, and play it in England.
Or at the same time, it's like, well, what do you mean? No, of course Meta owns all of the means of communication. It would be absurd if it were otherwise. You know, it's that we talked a little bit at the beginning of this discussion about computing in the 90s, when it would have been, when what we're talking about now, the world in which we live, would have seemed equally absurd, right? Yeah. The idea that it would be, what do you mean the moment I put a screwdriver in the bottom of my MacBook, it voids the warranty?
Yeah.
What do you mean, trying to explain an iPhone to someone who was very into computers in the 1990s, and saying like, well, yeah, you just go to the App Store, and they'd be, what are you talking about?
And it's a felony to use a different app store.
Yeah, exactly. You go to the App Store. Don't go to the wrong App Store, because obviously you'll go to jail. You won't be able to vote. And what I keep sort of hearing again and again and again, and this also connects back to the storytelling question, is that the world does not have to be like it is. It so recently wasn't like this.
Yeah, one of the riffs that you do a lot on Trashfuture, a lot of your riffs, I was saying before, live rent-free in my head. And one of the things that you talk about a lot is object permanence, and the idea that like once you stop being a baby, you should be technically capable of remembering that things used to be in one way and now they're not anymore, and maybe you could put them back that way, and that like this is literally one of the cognitive stages you go through as you progress through infanthood, and yet remembering that things used to be different has become really challenging. And one of the things that I like about writing science fiction set in the recent past, so these novels, I should say the story of these novels is that when I wrote 9 books in 3 years, a year and 2.5 years during lockdown in my hammock in my backyard in Los Angeles, trying to pretend the rest of the world wasn't literally and figuratively on fire as ashes sifted down out of the sky all around me, I got a little weird, and I had this conceit that I was going to write the last volume of a beloved long-running series that ties up all the loose ends with this kind of lovable rapscallion of a private detective, Martin Hench, who's a forensic accountant who's been in Silicon Valley for 40 years, unwinding every scam that every tech bro could think of. And I would do all of this without the tedious business of writing the rest of the series. It would just be the last episode. And I thought, everybody loves a last episode. I actually think someone should make a TV show that's just an ensemble cast, and every week they just do the last episode of an imaginary sitcom. I think it'd be fantastic. But I wrote this book, and it turns out that like when you confront the challenges of tying up all the loose ends in a beloved long-running series, it doesn't really matter if the series exists. You still get that same last day of summer camp vibe when you write it, or at least I did, because I sent it to my editor, who's a really lovely fellow, and has been my editor since I started writing novels, but who's not a very good email correspondent. And I thought it was going to be 4 months before I heard back. And instead, the next morning, there was an email in my inbox that was 3 lines long. That was a fucking ride. Whoa. And he bought 3 of them. And there's a problem, because this was the last adventure of Martin Hench. And he kind of earned his retirement by the end of this. He's a 67-year-old who gets up in the night to pee 4 times every night. He is like, he's done with it after his one last job here. And I didn't want to pull him out of retirement. Obviously, there's some precedent. You get Doyle bringing Sherlock Holmes back over Rickenbach Falls, but that was because Queen Victoria knighted him in exchange for doing it. And I checked, it turns out not even vice presidents of the Macmillan Company can knight you for writing books on demand. So I figured out eventually that I could write these in any sequence, and that it wouldn't make a difference. I think partly because I grew up in the 80s when sitcoms were all being aired out of sequence anyways. We never did see them in sequence. And honestly, like, it doesn't matter which Poirot book you pick up. You don't have to read them in order. You're pretty sure he's not going to die in any of them. So, apart from that, it doesn't matter where in sequence they go. And so I realized I could write these in any order, and that if I did that, I could just make stuff up, right? I didn't have to worry about continuity because I was always backshadowing, not foreshadowing. If there was a seeming contradiction in the narrative, I could resolve it with an interstitial episode that made those 2 facts reconcile with one another. And that the more I did this, the more of a premeditated motherfucker people would think I was. So I wrote 3 of these, and this is the last of the 3. I have more on the drawing board, but it's his first adventure. And as I worked through this, I started to realize that by writing speculative fiction, science fiction, about things that have already happened, in maybe the mode of William Gibson doing pattern recognition in that series and so on, that it was quite a powerful pushback against this idea that there is no alternative, that we just have to take whatever the tech companies give us, that by exploring the like contingent factors and the behind the scenes maneuvering that produces this world where you can only use the device the way it arrives and your customizations are limited to installing different wallpaper on your screen, is not a historic inevitability that, like contra Thatcher and there is no alternative, we can all think of 6 alternatives before breakfast, and the only thing that stops them from happening is this enshittigenic policy environment where we make the worst people in the world careless, not in the sense of being reckless, but in the sense of knowing how much harm they're doing and not caring because there's nothing we can do to punish them for it.
And I mean, when we talk about this, we're sort of going back to the book, jumping around a bit, that's all right. When we talk about this book, right, talking about it as a piece of science fiction, you know, there's for a distribution requirement in university, I had to take a class, like a random like writing class in science fiction. And I remember 2 things from that class. Number 1, Peter Watts is a great author. Number 2,
Fellow Canadian.
Fellow Canadian, your pal.
Yeah.
My interview subject one time.
Right.
But the other thing that I learned was about trying to define what science fiction is, right? And there's what I remember from this is there was a I believe Czech theorist, a guy called Darko Suvin, who writes about science fiction. He says, okay, well, what makes science fiction different from literary fiction? What makes it different from fantasy, right? Both fantasy and science fiction are writing about things that are made up, you know, but the difference is science fiction writes about things that are made up in explainable ways, right? It's he called this process cognitive estrangement, you know, and so he's like, okay, well, yes, it's different, but it's different in a way that follows a process that you can understand. It's estranged from you, but cognitively. It's like, okay, well, yeah, you're traveling faster than light, but you know, there is some material that was found that if you work on it in the same way, makes that happen. It bends the laws of physics. It acknowledges these things and then moves past them. So what is the main bit of cognitive estrangement in the Marty Hench books?
So I think that I would quibble a little with that definition, because I think faster than light and time travel and so on, although they sit comfortably within science fiction and not fantasy, are not readily distinguishable from fantasy, in the sense that like they defy the laws of physics as we understand them, and there's always a bit in the novel where they basically just say it's magic. Although they hand wave and they say it's magic that was created by someone in a lab coat instead of a dressing gown and a pointy hat, but it's still just magic. You know, I would say that at its best, what science fiction does is not describe the gadget, but ask what the technology, who the technology is doing things for, and who the technology is doing things to. That at its best, science fiction is a way of saying, what if we had a different social relationship here? And science fiction and fantasy, they're both rooted in pulp literature, which is great. I like stories that kind of do a lot of plot stuff and kind of whip into gear. One of the things about the Marty Hench books is they're like very firmly pulp detective novels. There's a lot of stuff going on in the books where just action, action, action. And I think that's true both of fantasy and science fiction broadly as genres. But science fiction is really at its best saying, you know, what happens if we use this differently? What happens if, you know, William Gibson's most famous quote, right? The street finds its own use for things. What happens if someone repurposes this technology? And I think that like we all delight in bodging. We all delight in Rube Goldberg machines. We all delight in, you know, Wallace and Gromit, right? This idea that there's a thing that's in your life, it doesn't really suit you the way it came out of the packet, but then you change it so that it does something else, and suddenly it's the thing that pleases you more than anything. It's exactly suiting your needs. And, you know, there's a kind of epistemological humility at work when technologists design technology to be changed by the users, where they say, I just don't know what problems you're going to have. You know, there's this great book by Don Norman that was very famous. It was written in the 80s called The Design of Everyday Things. And he's an engineer. And he wrote this book, Design of Everyday Things, that was a kind of scolding book to designers, saying the device first must be functional. Don't, you know, kind of criticizing things like touch screens where the buttons move around, right? That's a modern example. But that kind of thing where you're trying to drive and you want to, you know, pause the audio or turn up the air conditioning and the button has changed places and you've got to look at it. And he says, I don't care how good it looks. It has to be functional first. And 25 years later, he completely repudiated this book in a book called Emotional Design, where he said, everything we use, because it is complicated and interacts with other complicated things, no matter how well it's designed, is mostly broken most of the time. Everything is just not working the way the manufacturer, the designer thought it would work. And so every user is first and foremost a troubleshooter to try and nurse along these complicated things that we didn't think would, that aren't doing what the designer intended. And when you're troubleshooting, if you're angry, your thought process narrows down to this kind of red tinged circle, this tiny dot where you're just like, hitting the thing and saying, why don't you work? We call that percussive maintenance. But if you love it, if it makes you happy, if his example was the Bud vase in the VW reboot, the Beetle reboot. If it makes you happy, if you find it beautiful, then you will have a more expansive mindset when you're trying to fix it. And I think there's something to this, right? The idea that like the designer can't anticipate all the ways the user will use it. They can't anticipate all the future contingencies. So they make something that is the user's companion and not the user's adversary, so that when the user is trying to resolve the problems that will always come up, they will be in a good mood. And one of the gimmicks in this novel with these computers made by this Orthodox rabbi, this Catholic priest, and this Mormon bishop, is that the floppy disks come from the factory with one sector burned out. And when you try to run any of their programs on their computers, it checks to see whether it can read that sector. And if it can read that sector, it goes, oh, this didn't come from our factory because that sector isn't damaged, and it refuses to run. And this is a thing that is true. So Dan Bricklin and, oh gosh, I blanked his name, but the people who created VisiCalc, which is the first spreadsheet, they burned out one sector on the VisiCalc floppy disk at the factory, so that if you copied VisiCalc to give it to a mate or to make a backup of it, because floppy disks are just like, if you look at them cross-eyed, they go corrupt. And so you've got hundreds of dollars sunk into software. You want to make a backup of it. So if it could read that sector, it wouldn't boot. Now, Bob Frankston, Bricklin and Frankston, being the people who invented the hammer, the spreadsheet, everything is a nail. And all of their data from their whole life is in VisiCalc spreadsheets. And eventually, all of the computers that can run VisiCalc are obsolete, and all of the computers that can run operating systems that can run VisiCalc are obsolete. But thankfully, because computers are millions of times more powerful now than they were then, you can just simulate an older computer in a new computer, which is called emulation. Except that no one has ever done anything as demented as trying to figure out how to emulate a broken floppy disk. And so they can't run their own software, and they can't access their own data, because they didn't anticipate the contingency in which floppy disks cease to exist as a going concern. And this is the kind of design arrogance that I think makes a lot of us very angry, where we're like, oh, okay, sure, I know my phone would like to update its wallpaper, but at the same time, I quite need that 1% of battery I have to dial 999 and tell them that I am lost in the woods and there are wolves. And so I would like to interrupt the process by which my phone updates its wallpaper. And the designer's like, sorry, mate, this is very important to us.
You must have nice wallpaper.
Yeah.
And then the people rescuing you from the wolves will know what good taste you had. But what you're really talking about, and I think the thing that's kind of run through most of what we've discussed here, right? Whether it's directly political or more specifically technical, is really about power.
Yeah.
Right? Who has the power to do what? And what does it mean to imagine a world, whether it's politics or in books, where different people, maybe more people, have more power to do things, whether that's power to run the program they want in their computer, power to have a house they can afford. It all kind of comes back to the same fundamental question. Also, we've been given the light, so is there anything you want to leave these people with before we go to questions?
Yeah, I did want to say one thing. Tech policy is this very narrow sector of a movement that has kind of crept up on us, I think, all over the world, that is about anti-monopoly, what Americans call antitrust, or sometimes called competition law. And, that got put in a coma like 40 years ago. Under Thatcher and Reagan and Mulroney in Canada, we just stopped enforcing it. We let companies buy all their competitors and so on. And that's more or less what political science predicts, right? There are all these big studies of policy outcomes where they go and they look at thousands of policy fights and they go, okay, if the public really wants something, but rich people don't want it, does it happen? And the answer is kind of a resounding no, right? We don't get policies that are adverse to the interests of wealthy people, no matter how popular they are. I mean, there's a really damning study from 2014 where the abstract has this line that's something like, the preferences of organized citizen groups and the public at large have little to no impact on policy, right? Which is just like, kill me now, right? Like the only thing we can do is hope we bring a tear to a billionaire's eye so they go and they brief their mates and then we get the change we want. And the weird thing is that antitrust competition law has like kicked off everywhere, despite the fact that this is a thing that assuredly makes rich people poorer, right? The richest people we have are people who are controlling cartels, monopolies, duopolies. And it's happened, in Canada, where our Competition Bureau in its entire history has challenged 3 mergers and has successfully challenged 0 mergers, has now got this huge package of new powers. It happened in America starting under Trump and then continuing under Biden, and even the new Trump administration is carrying on some of this work. The EU has had this huge sea change where they're not like, okay, well, the problem is Mark Zuckerberg doesn't moderate Facebook well. We want him to have higher moderation standards. And now with the Digital Markets Act, it's like, no, you have to have ways for people to leave Facebook but still send messages to people they've left behind so that you can just have less power over their lives. We don't want you to spy on your users and control the ones who are naughty. We just want you to have no control. It's not that we have the wrong person sitting in Mark Zuckerberg's chair. It's that we should abolish the role of, unelected social media czar for life of 4 billion people. It's happened in like Spain, it's happened in France, it's happened in Germany, South Korea, Japan. Here, the Competition and Markets Authority for a decade under the worst Tory governments in living memory did some of the best work of any competition authority in the world. Keir Starmer just fired the head of the Competition and Markets Authority and replaced him with the head of Amazon UK, which is very bad. But this happened like here under governments that were incredibly deferential to powerful people. And this is like, I think, legitimately weird. And I think we don't really notice it. Like, this has swept China, right? The cyberspace directive cracks down on Chinese big tech in pretty much the same way the Digital Markets Act is doing it. Contra Nick Clegg saying, oh, we have to keep Facebook powerful because, Weibo is a stalking horse for Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is rounding up tech bosses and putting them in gulags because he thinks of them as competitors for power with the Chinese state. So this amazing thing has happened in like the last 5 years. We barely noticed that it's happened. It's incredible. It is like pigs flying. It is like water flowing uphill. It contravenes every commonplace of political science. And I think it's because it's part of a wider movement that recognizes that concentrated corporate power and wealth is an existential threat. And I think this coalition is just kind of implicitly formed around this that has created an invisible political wind that's very hard to stop. I'm very excited by it. I think it's parallel to like what happened in the 70s when suddenly we had the word ecology enter our lexicon, and suddenly people who thought that like, oh, what I care about is owls, so I don't have anything in common with that person who's worried about the ozone layer, realized, oh, no, the destiny of charismatic nocturnal avians is connected in some way to the gaseous composition of the upper atmosphere by the word ecology and the idea that ecology connects them. I think we're entering that moment in our politics. And, you asked about what gives me hope. That's what gives me hope, that like somehow governments everywhere, good ones, bad ones, conservative ones, progressive ones, have suddenly embraced this thing that is absolutely antithetical to the interests of the richest, worst people on earth, who in every other respect are winning every fight. And that is quite exciting.
Well, I think that's all we have time for. Cory, thank you so much.
Well, now it's Q&A, right?
It's Q&A now. It's all we have time for.
Oh, all we have time for.
Now it's you and them.
That's right. Sorry. So we have some mic runners. I'll let you know a question is never more of a comment than a question. And a good question has one part and not two. So with that benediction in mind. All right, there we go.
Yeah, you talked a bit about, and you write a lot about organizations, like the EFF and the Internet Archive. I just wonder what UK-based or EU-based organizations kind of excite you the most?
Thank you for correcting that error, because I helped found a UK pressure group called the Open Rights Group. Is Pam here? Oh, there's Pam. Pam covering from Open Rights Group. I'm sure she'd be happy to talk to you more about it. And Open Rights Group does incredible campaigning on digital issues here in the UK. And obviously I support them and still serve on their advisory board. So yeah, ORG, a very clever acronym that we came up with, org. Yeah. I understand if all of the things that we said were extremely non-controversial and easily grasped and no one has any feedback. Yeah.
So there's some of the cases where you're saying we need regulation, like with the Apple App Store and the predatory 3%. I find that like pretty uncontroversial, but one thing I'm wondering about is like, how do you make sure that it's not just good intentions, but also people with competence that develop these regulations? And I'm thinking of cases like Europe clicking so many accept cookie banners every single day.
So this is a really good question, and I think we under-theorize what sometimes called administrability, like how easy it is to administer a policy. So you can say, you know, Facebook has to stop hate speech, which is a thing that's super important. You know, obviously hate speech falls disproportionately on people who are vulnerable, and often those people feel like they can't leave Facebook because it's their only lifeline to people they left in another country, or the people who support them with their rare disease, or even just like how they organize their kids, you know, carpools for the football matches, and they just can't seem to go, and so they're stuck there. The problem with a hate speech rule, it's very hard to administer, right? First you have to agree on like what hate speech is. Then you have to adjudicate whether a specific thing is hate speech. Then you have to figure out whether or not Facebook took reasonable technical steps to block the hate speech, which, like, to a first approximation, everybody who knows how Facebook works for Facebook. So you have to depose some engineer for 7 years to figure it out. And this is like a thing that's happening like 100 times a minute, and it takes you 8 years to answer one question about it, right? So it's just like, it's not great. GDPR, which is this thing where we have all these cookie consent dialogues, those are illegal under the GDPR. So this wasn't an administrative problem, right? GDPR, like the way it should work is you just click anywhere on the screen and you just don't get spied on. And the only reason you would have to click through a ton of those dialogues is if you wanted to give lots of explicit permission to have lots of data gathered on you, which I think like most of us don't want. You know, Apple put that tick box in iOS, the iPhone operating system, that was like, don't let apps spy on me. And 96% of iOS users clicked it. I assume the other 4% were drunk or Facebook employees. And that makes a lot of sense, because if I worked at Facebook, I would be drunk all the time. But, you know, that's all you should have to do. The problem with the GDPR enforcement is not the way the rule was written, it's European federalism, because you have like 5 European countries who are locked in a race to see who can be the biggest tax haven. And the current winner is mostly Ireland, which is why all these tech companies pretend they're Irish, which keeps their money floating in a state of untaxable grace somewhere over the Irish Sea. And the thing is, if you can pretend you're based in Dublin this week, you can pretend you're based in Malta next week, right? And so you need something to keep people there, you know, keep firms there once they set up office there, because they've already demonstrated their capability to move, which means you have to be a crime haven. And so the Irish Data Commissioner basically does nothing, right? Like, on a good day, if they get out of bed, they spend most of the day in their pajamas watching cartoons and eating breakfast cereal. So all of these big cases that have gone to Ireland about GDPR violations just died there. And it's really funny, because after GDPR came in, it's 9th year now, almost all the European surveillance advertising companies just immediately went out of business, because they didn't have the excess profits to hire all the lawyers it takes to pretend that they were Irish. And so they just all went out of business, which just left these giant American tech companies, which were a slosh in money that they could use to corrupt the Irish political system. And so like gradually over years, you have people like Max Schrems, who runs a nonprofit called NOYB, None of Your Business, that has dragged these cases into the German court or the Austrian court. Very slow, painful process. Eventually, like, these companies will be brought to heel, but with the new European rules, the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act, they move all the privacy enforcement straight to the federal European court. So you don't start in the national court of the firm, you know, where they're nominally headquartered. You start straight in Strasbourg, and that should make things better. That should improve the administration of the rule. Meanwhile, I'll go back to hate speech. Like, I think that we have to understand that the biggest problem of hate speech is not that people have bad ideas, although that's a problem, and I wish people had better ideas. It's that these platforms are so structurally important that no matter how much abuse is heaped on you, it can be very hard to leave them. And so having a rule that says, like, if someone leaves Facebook or Twitter and goes to Blue Sky or Mastodon or some other platform, some Eurostack platform, that they can still send and receive messages from the people who stayed behind on legacy media, in the same way that, like, you can switch from like Orange to T-Mobile and like no one even notices. Like, it would be very weird if you picked up the phone the next time it rang and said, "You won't believe whose SIM I have in my phone today. You know, yesterday when you rang my number, it was a Vodafone SIM. Today it's an Orange SIM, and I've never been happier," right? Like, it just could just disappear, at which point you could just leave, right? And you could leave for some place with better moderation policies, including a place that you and your friends run. And you wouldn't have to worry about making that Sophie's choice between leaving behind your friends and your support network and, you know, all these things that matter to you. That's a highly administrable process because, you know, as the way this works right now on Mastodon, it's just a little text file, an XML file, a little program file that has all the people you follow and all the people who follow you, and you download it from one server and you upload it to another server. It's 2 clicks and you just move over. And so, like, say, you know, you're running Twitter and I want to leave and you won't send me that file, and we go to the regulator and you say, no, I gave Cory the file. They don't have to have an evidentiary proceeding. They're just like, okay, Cory says he didn't get it. How about you give it to me and I'll pass it on to him, right? You could have like 10 people administering this for all of Europe. And it would be cheap as hell and incredibly reliable because you're not resolving fact-intensive questions. You're just easing the departure of people from platforms that abuse them and don't care about their well-being, and in a way that is super crisp and well-defined. So this is like I think a way that we could really make policy differences, and it requires that we attend to both like the policy goal and the technical matter of how the policy can be accomplished. I think that the DMA and the DSA are pretty good in that regard. They really did like get smart people, and I think it's a trap we fall into where we go, oh, you know, you look at Parliament, it's a bunch of, you know, bloated old boomers who don't understand technology, and they have to get their staff to show them how to like turn off alerts and, you know, whatever, right? And that may be so, but like every government of every modern country is capable of making highly technical policy, even if the Parliament doesn't have technical experts, right? Like, I used to use the example of we can have navigable waters that aren't full of shit, even though we don't have microbiologists in Parliament. We can see how that failed, but like it worked pretty well for a long time, and it didn't fail because all of the parliamentarians who understood water policy lost an election and were replaced by parliamentarians who didn't understand water policy. It failed because you got a cartel of firms that captured the state. But it is entirely possible for technical expertise to run out of the administrative state that is overseen by the democratically elected government. So, you know, there was a guy, David Nutt, who was the drug czar here. He got fired in a thing called the Nutsack Affair, you may remember. And he's a psychopharmacologist, super smart. And one of the things Parliament asked him to do was review the way that recreational drugs are scheduled in this country. So, you know, how illegal are they illegal, and so on. And so he convened a panel of experts that made a numeric rating for the hardship that abuse of a drug inflicted on the user, on their immediate family, and on society at large. And then from that, he could form tables that said, well, some drugs have very stable ratings. They're either not harmful or they're very harmful. But there's a whole bunch of drugs whose harm really depends on how you prioritize harm to the user, or harm to their family, or harm to society. And he said, that's a political choice. That's not an empirical choice. Parliament, you tell us which of these things you want to safeguard, and we will tell you where the drug lands in the schedule. And then he got fired for refusing to say that cannabis was less harmful than, or more harmful than alcohol, because it empirically is not more harmful than alcohol. And this country is, drinks industry is run by 3 giant firms, and they had captured Parliament, and so he got fired. But it is entirely possible to make good technical policy with outside experts that reflects political will. And there are ways that politics and empiricism can interact with each other. Yep.
Hopefully you can answer this question off on the top of your head, but I just want to clarify about your book Attack Surface.
Yeah.
Who exactly is Litvinchuk in the Slovakian government?
Who's Litvinchuk? He's a secret policeman, right? But he's not really based on any individual person. So the questions about my novel Attack Surface is the 3rd Little Brother book. He's not based on any one person, but I wrote that book after the collapse of the Ukrainian government, after the Euromaidan demonstrations. And it was an extraordinary moment, not just because of the popular uprising, but because it was so public, and because, unlike, say, German Truth and Reconciliation, where it took decades for how the technical documents about how the Stasi operated to enter the public domain, it was almost instantaneous in Ukraine. Like, we just immediately found out how the security apparatus was functioning. And that acted as a kind of accelerant to pro-democracy movements within the country that really did want to root out the old boys network that had run the country for so long. And it was this combination of dissatisfaction with how things were, along with this outpouring of technical detail about why they were that way, how it was accomplished. And again, to this idea that it wasn't inevitable. These weren't choices that arrived, to the passive voice, right? Mistakes were made, that these were active decisions made by named individuals in living memory that made things so bad for you and the people you loved, that made people so energized to change the way their state worked. And so, I don't know that he's a baddie, but I don't know that he's a particularly exaggerated baddie relative to the some of the baddies we lost during the color revolutions. For one thing, he didn't have a menagerie, which I toyed with giving him a zoo, a private zoo, because the dictator of Ukraine had a private zoo, but I thought that was just a little too Dr. Evil.
Hello, Cory.
Hi.
My question is about your book, The Internet Gone.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, you start the book saying something like, this book is for the people who want to destroy big tech.
Yeah.
Now, that book is of 2023.
Yeah.
2 years later, considering all things happening in the United States, including the rise of big tech oligarch, how is the plan doing? And would you eventually change anything?
Yeah, so I do think that, ironically, we are in a better position to change things than we were then. I think that as I said earlier, the strange case of Donald Trump is that suddenly countries around the world can contemplate policy choices that were absolutely off the table. So when I worked for EFF, I was their European director, and I worked outside of the EU as well. I was in 31 countries for them. And over again, when you spoke to people in the political apparatus, whether elected or expert regulators, they said, all of this sounds very good. We should modify technology so that it reflects our local priorities, so that it doesn't send our data to the NSA, so it doesn't do all these things that we don't like. But the problem is we would get hit with tariffs. So right now in Europe, there's this move to build the Euro stack, right, to make interoperable technologies that will allow people to leave Office 365 and Google Drive and, you know, Google Search and Facebook social networking and Twitter social networking and move to a European hosted, ideally like free and open, you know, monopoly resistant, surveillance resistant platform. The thing is that no one's going to do that unless there's a path to leave, right? No one's going to leave behind all their data in someone's cloud. No one's going to leave behind all their relationships on some social network. So for there to be a Eurostack, we need to have, like, we need to be able to break open the American tech platforms and create these bridges between them, you know, so that you can like get your data out. And, you know, the easiest way to do that is not to like order Facebook to give you your data. It's to make it possible for European engineers to just like extract the data that Facebook is holding on you, you know, your relationships, your posts and so on, to extract that from your device, to extract that from the service, to scrape it out, to pull it out of memory of your phone, to just grab it. Because, you know, if you tell Facebook they have to do it, they're just going to tie you up in court for 10 years. But if you rescind the legal protection that was created with the copyright directive in 2001 under threat of tariff, like someone will just figure it out. Like it's not that hard. Like a couple of years ago, these two teenagers got fucked off with Instagram and how many ads and boosted posts and whatever there were in it. So they made an app called OG app that would log you into Instagram, pretend to be you on Instagram, grab everything Instagram wanted to show you, throw away all the ads, throw away all the boosted posts, throw away all the suggestions, and just show you stuff from people that you followed in reverse chronological order. And it was within a day in the top 10 of both two app stores. And the next day, Facebook shut it down, right? But like, it wasn't technically hard for two teenagers to defeat all of the engineers of Instagram, right? The thing that stopped them was that Mark Zuckerberg could go out at his office door and turn right and walk into the building full of lawyers. If he had to turn left and walk into the building full of engineers, we'd probably still have OG app. You know, I think that like in our haste to like reckon with the consequences of unilateral action by technologists, we've thrown out the baby with the bathwater. Sometimes it's fine when technologists unilaterally change how technology works, provided that they're doing it in service to you so that the technology works the way you want it, and not because they want to replace all the taxi drivers with immiserated gig workers, right? And I think like move fast and break things is fine if it's moving fast and breaking kings. And, you know, this is once in a quarter century opportunity that we have. Everybody wants to get the hell out of America's tech stacks. The easiest way to do it is to just crack them open unilaterally and not beg them for permission to get our data off of them or try and sue it out of them.
So I've been shown the light.
Yeah.
Do we have time for one more question that has a one-word answer? All right. Does anybody have a question that lends itself to a one-word answer?
It would be better if I had to come up with the word first and then someone had to come.
Yeah, we're going to do Jeopardy.
Okay, this could be a yes or no question. So you've talked about the enormous potential opportunity that any country could have that could choose to just let us break the locks, use the moment, and do it. Now, I don't expect that the country will be the UK, because we're very wedded to the idea that we're going to be America's little buddy, right? There will be an exception, but you're a Canadian, you're a well-respected writer. I'm not asking you to drop names, but is anyone listening?
Yeah, no, I completely think they are. I mean, I think one of the things about Trump is that whenever he does, I'm sorry, that's not one answer. Let me say this really quick.
That first sentence alone was 6.
When Trump wins, he always does something to screw it up. So, you know, Canada just caved. We had this digital services tax that we were going to bring in. Mark Carney just caved. I guarantee you that sometime in the next 2 months, Trump is going to say something so unbelievably stupid or do something so grossly offensive that people are like, no, we need to bring back that digital services tax. Because this is a man who cannot stop tripping over his own dick, right? He is just incapable of quitting while he's ahead. And so I think there are, like in Canada, in Mexico, in lots of countries in the global south, I think in Europe, there's a real opportunity right now. And maybe in the UK.
All right. Well, that takes us way more than one word, but that takes us to the end of the Q&A section. So I think all that remains is to say, please correct me if I'm wrong, various event producers, thank you very much to the Conduit Club for being such a lovely audience today.
Thank you.
And
And we have a bookseller at the back of the room, and I bought this on the internet. It's a stick that makes books non-returnable. I'm going to sit over there, and you can come over, and I'll show you how it works.
thank you, everybody.